Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our new study in Moral Laws by Edgar Sheffield Brightman. We're going to take a look at Chapter 3 now, and we do know that Brightman writes phenomenology. He's an empiricist, but he also includes human consciousness. He writes phenomenology. And in this book, he is going to take the first 4 chapters and shape a structural phenomenology. And the first 4 chapters cover logic, structure, data, and system. Logic, structure, data, and system. We've already looked at logic and structure. In this chapter, we look at data for ethics, and then the next chapter is on system. So in 4 chapters, he's going to give his reader the phenomenology for ethics, which will be the foundation for the remainder of the book. So we're going to take a look at the data of ethics. We're going to look at pages 55 to 81. We begin with value data in block 1. We look at experience as concept. Ethics is the science of the control of experience. Experience equals the whole field of consciousness. That's phenomenology. Experience equals the whole field of consciousness. Ongoing conscious activity, including empirical factors and rational factors, including the study of human nature. In other words, it's empirical, but it's not brute fact. It's empirical, including ongoing conscious activity. Now, under moral experience, conduct includes physical acts and mental acts. Conduct is voluntary act and relational act related to the mental. Moral experience includes a 4-fold consciousness of choice, of value, of obligation, and law. So those are the 4 categories that the data is going to take up. You've got human consciousness of choice, value, obligation, and law. That's your moral experience categories. And under those 4 categories, Brightman will arrange his data. Now we look at the sociological data of objective place. It includes all data from the 6 social sciences of sociology, anthropology, ethnology, criminology, economics, and history. Self must evaluate each situation in order to apply any moral law. That should be sociological evaluation before applying moral law. Then we look at the psychology contribution of subjective value. The cause of behavior is the mind. We begin with the fact of moral consciousness. It's a consciousness that abbreviates value, obligation, and law. Value equals the posited ideal and the positive follow-up action. Real life consists of ideal values. And again, we have to understand what Brightman means by the real. Real life consists of ideal values. Well, the real is the same real that Hegel has. It's the same concept. The real is the posited real. It is the spiritual perceived real hidden behind empirical reality, hidden behind the sensate. So the real is the ideal of kingdom. It's posited real. It's the realm of positing that we want to actualize, but it begins as a realm of positing. So Brightman says real life consists of the ideal values. But basically our value data comes from the categories of value, obligation, and law. Value, obligation, and law. And free choice. Now in block 2 we took a look at the obligation and law data. to add to that value data of block 1, we have the psychology of obligation. Obligation addresses the self's will. Obligation equals the unique feeling when the self posits and internalizes an ideal of value. Within the context of obligation, there are new emergent qualities that arise. Therefore, it is evolutionary and a fact of experience. Obligation is necessitated by an ongoing critique of criticism and interpretation. Interpretation in order to revise our conceptualization of the real. Under the psychology of law, the self forms generalizations. They universalize experience. Moral law is the rational factor in experience. It is the rational and directional factor in experience. Remember, it is a teleology, so it's the rational and the directional factor in experience. But Christian doctrine does posit the doctrine of sin also, so there is a posited irrational factor. But Brightman says generally the rational process guides the consciousness to control the irrational. That's your ideal. The rational process guides consciousness to control the irrational. Then we look at note 3, the emotional consciousness of pleasure and pain, but they are distinct. Pleasure is immediate and sensate. Happiness is enduring consciousness and holistic happiness. It's a hupomeno enduring of the ideal, of realization of the ideal. So we have basically initial data of value and obligation and law. Those are categories for data that we will gather for our phenomenology of ethics. But it all contributes, as we know from previous lessons, it all contributes to Brightman's concept of coherence. So if you look at block 3, value data plus law and obligation data equal moral unity of consciousness, or coherence. We begin with a psychological mechanistic influence. Brightman says we are influenced by conditioned reflexes and by the subconscious self. And he says, is free rational choice possible? And he says, yes, we do posit the notion of agent responsibility, the self as responsible agent, because we take up the moral voluntary act. We make choices among real, ideal possibilities. That is the premise upon which Brightman forms his philosophy of ethics, his Christian philosophy of ethics. We do make choices among real, ideal possibilities. Now, the means of actualization are these possibilities. In note 2, spiritual freedom equals this function of choosing. Free choice is based on approval. We say yes or no to a given content, and our moral choice affects our direction of teleological development, that telos of development. A free act combines both necessity and possibility. Free moral act passes through the following stages. We begin with a given. We are faced with a givenness of situation. We then take up negation. We negate all perceived impulse tendencies. We negate the impulse. Then we take up analysis and positing. We deliberate over available and anticipated possibilities and posit our choice of the real ideal that is seeking to be imprinted on the sensate and raise up the sensate to a higher level of spiritual existence. And then after analyzing and positing, then we take up praxis. We go out of the self in a praxis of actualization. So we begin with the given situation. We negate impulses that are trying to interfere with analysis and positing of the real. That comes through deliberation of all available possibilities. Then we move on to that follow-up of praxis, the praxis of actualizing the ideal. We do this in order to reach those 4 steps we do in order to reach a unity of consciousness, or coherence, in Note 3. Every conscious being is a complex unity. We are a unity of diverse conscious factors. It's a coherent string of memory, of present analysis, and future anticipation. So it's memory, it's analytical, and it is anticipatory. And it's all joined together by relational signs of consciousness, by the linkage of consciousness is what Brightman calls it. Moral self posits an interest in holistic self, or this notion of coherence. We are a unity in diversity aiming toward the ideal of kingdom. We are an individual unity in diversity, and we are a corporate unity in diversity aiming toward the realization of the ideal of kingdom. We do that by taking up the 4 categories of choice, value, obligation, and law, and then abbreviating under those 4 categories of choice, value, obligation, and law, the data, the value data that we perceive, and the obligation that we feel pressed upon, and the law of the movement of spirit, the law of the presence of objective spirit that raises the finite into a higher level of spiritual existence. But it's all leading toward coherence. We don't have just a collective individual pieces of value data. They're gathered into a holistic system, and we posit a system of the real. We posit a systematic picture of the real. A sign model is the better way to say it. We posit a sign model of kingdom that we seek to realize through chapter 1, through our logic of faith, structured as moral law that guides and directs civil and religious law in order to reach coherence. That kind of summarizes what we've gone through here. We do take up the logic of faith, of experimental positing, outgoing desire for the ideal, and interpretive construction of the real. We do this by gathering value possibilities that are available in objective reality, and we couple that with our motivational base of obligation, an obligation to realize kingdom and to realize the ideal. And all of that functions as a teleology aiming toward unity of consciousness, enjoined consciousness with the divine consciousness of spirit, and with corporate consciousness of the ecclesia, called out ones. So we do get involved in this ongoing dialectic of gathering data during praxis ministry. It's always a praxis activity. It's not just thinking. We don't remain in the self. We go out of the self. That's Hegel's phenomenology that Brightman takes up. We do go out of the self, but we go out of the self dialectically, knowing that we will have the return moment of interpretive construction. That helps us to refine our understanding of moral law. It helps us to refine our understanding of future anticipated possibilities of the ideal. All of it contributes to coherence. So the key point to remember here is that we have looked at the logic of faith. We have looked at the structure of moral law, abbreviating civil and religious law, and now we looked at the gathering of data under the categories of choice, value, obligation, and law. We've covered logic, structure, and data. Logic, structure, and data have been covered, and we're going to pull this together in the next chapter on system. And that'll wrap up chapter 3.